Whether you were hopping on Goombas in Super Mario Bros. Or searching for the Triforce in The Legend of Zelda, those were the heavy hitters that defined a generation. But let's face it, those titles are practically royalty at this point, and we've all heard enough about them. Today we're shining the spotlight on the underdogs, the hidden gems, the games that flew under the radar, drowned out by bigger names or bad timing. I'm talking about the underrated NES games. Titles that didn't get their moment back in the day, but are absolutely worth picking up now. So, if you're tired of hearing about these same old classics and ready to dig into some seriously unappreciated gold, stick around. You're going to want to play every single one of these titles. Alright, kicking things off at number 5, we've got Little Samson. If you've never heard of it, don't feel bad. It's one of the rarest NES games out there. Developed by Takiro and published by Taito in 1992, Little Samson hit the shelves at a time when everyone's attention was shifting to the shiny new SNES. Talk about bad timing, right? But don't let its obscurity fool you. This game isn't just a collector's trophy. It's legit one of the best platformers on the system. And I'm not just throwing that out there. Little Samson does something that very few NES games could pull off. It's accessible, creative, and absolutely gorgeous for its time. Let's break it down. The game gives you control of 4 different characters, and each one plays completely differently. You've got Samson, the little nimble dude who can climb walls and toss projectiles. Then there's Kikira, the dragon who can fly and spit fire. Gam, the golem, is your tank. Slow, but strong. And then there's KO, the mouse, who's tiny, fast, and can drop bombs. Switching between these characters is seamless and honestly, kind of genius. It's not just a gimmick. Each level is designed to take advantage of their unique abilities, so you're constantly adapting your strategy. And let's talk about those visuals. By 1992 standards, Little Samson was pushing the SNES to its limits. The sprite work is crisp, the animations are smooth, and the levels are packed with detail. From lush forests to fiery caverns, each stage feels distinct. It's one of those games that reminds you just how much the NES was capable of when developers really knew what they were doing. But what really sells this game for me is the polish. The controls are tight, like Mega Man tight. Everything feels responsive, which is crucial when platforming starts getting tricky. And the difficulty curve? Chef's kiss. It's challenging, sure, but it's never unfair. You're encouraged to experiment with different characters, and the game rewards you for it. So why is this masterpiece sitting at number 5 instead of being celebrated alongside the likes of Super Mario Bros. 3? Well, like I said, the timing was brutal. By 1992, most of NES players were already moving to the 16-bit era. Add to that a limited print run, and Little Samson just didn't stand a chance at making a splash. These days, though, it's earned a bit of a cult following. If you've got the cash, and I mean a lot of cash, you can hunt down an original cartridge. But if not, there's always emulation or re-releases on modern platforms. Either way, this is a game you have to play if you're serious about exploring the best of the NES. Coming in at number 4 is Clash at Demon Head, a game that's as bizarre as its name suggests. Developed by Vic Tokai and released in 1990, this one feels like it was made by a team that said, let's throw every idea we have into a blender and see what happens. The result? A wild hybrid of action, platforming, and RPG mechanics, and non-linear exploration that somehow works. The game kicks off as you playing Billy Bang Blitz, a secret agent tasked with saving a kidnapped professor and stopping a doomsday device. Pretty standard setup, right? But here's where Clash at Demon Head takes a sharp left turn. Instead of following a linear path, the game lets you explore a sprawling map with over 40 interconnected routes. Think Super Mario Bros. Meets Metroid, with a dash of Zelda 2 thrown in for good measure. This open-ended approach is what makes the game so memorable. You're constantly finding new paths, doubling back to revisit areas with fresh abilities, and talking to NPCs who give you cryptic hints or sell you upgrades. It's this sense of freedom and discovery that sets Clash at Demon Head apart. It was ahead of its time in so many ways, predating what we now call the Metroidvania genre by several years. And speaking of abilities, let's talk about the Force powers. Throughout the game, you unlock skills like levitation, invincibility, and even teleportation, which lets you bypass certain obstacles or find hidden secrets. Combine that with a currency system where you can buy weapons, upgrades, and even jetpacks, and you've got a game that feels incredibly deep for its era. It's not just about running and gunning, it's about planning, experimenting, and adapting to whatever the game throws at you. And man, does this game love to throw weird stuff at you. One minute you're fighting giant mechs, and the next you're chatting with a sentient mushroom who gives you life advice. The tone is all over the place in the best way possible. It's quirky, self-aware, and packed with dialogue that's just as entertaining as the gameplay. For an NES game, the sheer personality here is off the charts. Now, let's be real, it's not perfect. The controls can feel a little floaty at times, and the difficulty spikes are brutal. It's one of those games where you'll die a lot, but every time you figure out how to overcome an obstacle, it feels incredibly rewarding. Plus, the soundtrack, while not as iconic as some other NES titles, has this funky, upbeat vibe that keeps you engaged during even the toughest moments. So why is Clash at Demon Head underrated? For starters, Vic Tokai wasn't exactly a household name in gaming, and the game didn't have the marketing muscle to compete with heavyweights like Mega Man or Castlevania. It also didn't fit neatly into any one genre, which might have confused players at the time. But for those who gave it a shot, it was, and still is, something truly special. These days, it's a bit of a cult classic, especially among retro gaming fans who love uncovering hidden gems. If you're into games that push boundaries of what the NES could do, Clash at Demon Head is absolutely worth the playthrough. It's weird, it's challenging, and it's way more ambitious than it had any right to be. Give it a shot, and you'll see what I mean. Taking the number 3 spot is Crystallis, an action RPG developed by SNK and released in 1990. Now I know what you're thinking, SNK? Aren't those the Metal Slug guys? Yeah, they are. But before they became synonymous with arcade brawlers and fighters, they dropped this absolute gem on the NES. And trust me, Crystallis deserves way more attention than it gets. The premise is immediately intriguing. It's set in a post-apocalyptic world where technology has been wiped out by a catastrophic war, leaving humanity to rebuild using magic. You play as a mysterious hero who wakes up from the cryogenic sleep 100 years after the war, tasked with stopping an evil empire from unleashing a new wave of destruction. It's like The Legend of Zelda meets Mad Max, with a sprinkle of anime flair. What sets Crystallis apart is its real-time combat. Unlike many RPGs of the era that relied on a turn-based system, this game throws you directly into the action. You've got swords infused with elemental powers, which you can charge up to unleash devastating attacks. Whether you're slicing through hordes of enemies or solving environmental puzzles by switching between fire, wind, water, and thunder abilities, the combat feels fast, fluid, and way ahead of its time. But combat is only half the story. Crystallis nails exploration and progression in a way that keeps you hooked from start to finish. The overworld is massive, with towns, caves, and dungeons that are packed with secrets to uncover. You're constantly upgrading your gear, learning new spells, and finding items that open up previously inaccessible areas. It's got that perfect balance where you've never stuck for too long, but always feel like you're earning some progress. And let's not ignore the music. The soundtrack is, hands down, one of the best on the NES. SNK's composers went all out here, creating tracks that range from hauntingly atmospheric to downright epic. Whether you're wandering through a desolate wasteland or battling a towering boss, the music sets the tone perfectly. Now, as much as I love this game, it's not without its quirks. The story, while ambitious, can be a little hard to follow thanks to some awkward translation issues. And while the game's challenges is a part of the charm, there are moments where the difficulty spikes out of nowhere. But honestly, those are minor gripes in the grand scheme of things. So why didn't Crystallis become a bigger hit? Timing for one. It dropped the same year as Final Fantasy and just a year before The Legend of Zelda: A Link to the Past launched on the SNES. It also didn't help that SNK was better known for their arcade titles. So Crystallis didn't get the marketing push it deserved. But here's the thing, those who've played it know. Crystallis has a cult following for a reason. It's one of those games that feels like it was ahead of its time, blending action, RPG elements, and storytelling into something truly special. If you're into exploring expansive worlds, experimenting with cool abilities, and getting lost in a great soundtrack, this is one NES game you need to experience. Sliding into the number 2 spot is Journey to Silius, a side-scrolling run-and-gun game developed by Sunsoft and released in 1990. If you're into tight gameplay, killer soundtracks, and a cyberpunk vibe, this one is a must-play. But let me tell you, Journey to Silius has a backstory that's almost as interesting as the game itself. Originally, Sunsoft was developing this as a Terminator game. Yep, that's right, Terminator. But somewhere along the line, they lost the licensing rights. But rather scrap the project, they pivoted, reworking the assets and story into something original. Honestly, it's one of the best Plan B decisions in gaming history, because what we got is a cyberpunk classic that stands completely on its own. The game follows Jay McCrae, a young man seeking revenge after his father, a space colony architect, is killed in a terrorist attack. Armed with a variety of weapons, Jay takes on robotic enemies and massive bosses as he fights his way through 6 beautifully designed levels. The story might sound simple, but it's the way the game delivers it, with its atmospheric visuals and haunting tone that really makes it hit. Speaking of visuals, Journey to Silius is a feast for the eyes. Sunsoft was known for squeezing every bit of power out of the NES, and this game is no exception. The backgrounds are rich with detail, from the crumbling cities to the eerie industrial wastelands. The sprite animations are smooth, and the designs for the enemy robots and bosses have this gritty, dystopian flair that screams late 80s sci-fi. And then there's the gameplay. At its core, it's a run-and-gun in the vein of Contra, but with heavier emphasis on strategy. You start with a standard pistol, but as you progress, you pick up a small arsenal of weapons. Shotguns, machine guns, and even a grenade launcher. The twist? Each weapon uses the same energy pool, so you've got to manage your ammo carefully. This adds a layer of depth that keeps the combat feeling fresh and rewarding. But let's be real, the crown jewel of Journey to Silius is its soundtrack. Sunsoft's audio team pioneered a technique that made NES soundtracks richer by simulating bass lines using the system's limited sound channels. The result? Tracks that sound way more complex and atmospheric than they have any right to. Just fire up the Stage 1 theme and you'll see what I mean. It's pure 8-bit perfection. Of course, like any NES game worth its salt, Journey to Silius is tough as nails. The enemy patterns are relentless, and the platforming sections require precision timing. But the difficulty never feels cheap. It's the kind of challenge that keeps you coming back for one more try. Every victory feels earned, and every boss you take down feels like a genuine accomplishment. So why didn't Journey to Silius get the recognition it deserved? Well, losing the Terminator license didn't do it any favors. Without the movie tie-in, it didn't have the marketing hook to compete with juggernauts like Mega Man or Contra. And while it's since gained a cult following, back in the day, it wasn't easy for this one to slip through the cracks. But now, there's no excuse not to play it. Whether you're drawn in by the visuals, the gameplay, or the incredible soundtrack, Journey to Silius delivers on all fronts. It's a perfect example of how the NES era could produce games that were more than just fun. They were unforgettable experiences. Finally, taking the top spot on the list is Faxanadu, an adventure platformer developed by Nihon Falcom and published by Hudson Soft in 1989. If you've never played it, you're missing out on one of the most atmospheric and ambitious games the NES had to offer. For a console filled with colorful, family-friendly adventures, Faxanadu dared to go darker, giving players a gritty, immersive fantasy world that felt completely unique. Set in a decaying land connected to the massive world tree, Faxanadu places you in the boots of a nameless wanderer who returns home to find his village in ruins. The elves and dwarves who once coexisted peacefully have gone to war, the dwarves corrupted by an evil force spreading through the tree. It's your job to climb the world tree, defeat the evil one, and restore balance to the land. The stakes feel high from the start, and the grim tone makes the story hit harder than most NES games of its time. From the moment you start playing, Faxanadu hooks you with its art direction. This isn't the bright, cheerful aesthetic of the games like Super Mario Bros. Instead, everything in Faxanadu feels weathered, ancient, and alive with decay. The crumbling villages, labyrinth dungeons, and twisted tree branches create an oppressive atmosphere that feels miles ahead of its time. Combined with a somber, ambient soundtrack, and you've got a game that sucks you into its world like few others on the NES. Gameplay-wise, Faxanadu blends side-scrolling action with RPG elements. You'll explore sprawling areas, fight enemies in real-time combat, and collect gold to buy weapons, armor, and magic. The progression system is satisfying. Each upgrade makes a noticeable difference, which is good because the game doesn't pull its punches. Enemies are tough, and resource management is critical, especially when it comes to those healing items and magic. The controls are tight, but they've got a deliberate weight to them, which adds to the sense that you're navigating a harsh, unforgiving world. Combat requires precision, especially against tough bosses, who don't just look intimidating, they hit like trucks. And then there are the puzzles, which often require a mix of exploration, trial and error, and paying attention to the cryptic hints scattered throughout the game. It's challenging, but the payoff is always worth it when you finally crack a tough section. One of the most innovative features of Faxanadu is its use of NPCs. The towns are filled with characters who give you cryptic advice, sell you items, or even offer magic spells. The interactions feel more fleshed out than most games of its era, and they add a sense of life to the world. You're not just passing through a static location, you're part of a living, breathing ecosystem that's struggling to survive. Of course, no game is perfect. Faxanadu has its quirks, like an occasionally clunky menu system and a bit of a grind for gold if you're not careful with your spending. And while the story is compelling, some of the narrative beats are easy to miss if you're not talking to every NPC or paying close attention to item descriptions. But those are minor issues in what's otherwise a stellar experience. So why is Faxanadu so underrated? Part of it comes down to timing. It launched before The Legend of Zelda had cemented the template for fantasy action adventures, so it didn't get the recognition it deserved. And while it was loosely connected to the Dragon Slayer series, it was marketed as a standalone game in the West, which might have confused players who were unfamiliar with Falcom's work. But make no mistake, Faxanadu is a masterpiece. It's a bold, atmospheric adventure that pushes the NES hardware to its limits and created a world that still feels fresh and engaging decades later. If you're a fan of games like Castlevania 2 or The Legend of Zelda, you owe it to yourself to climb the world tree and see what this game has to offer. It's everything you could want in an underrated gem, and then some. And there you have it, 5 underrated NES games that prove there's way more to the console than plumbers and princesses. Whether it's the platforming perfection of Little Samson, the offbeat brilliance of Clash at Demon Head, the RPG depth of Crystallis, the cyberpunk intensity of Journey to the Ilus, or the atmospheric adventure of Faxanadu, these games show that the NES library is as rich as it is iconic. So do yourself a favor, dust off your NES, fire up your favorite emulator, or drop an irresponsible amount of cash on eBay. However you do it, play these games. Your thumbs will thank you, your backlog will curse you, and your nostalgia levels will skyrocket. Now, if you'll excuse me, I've got to figure out how to explain to my wallet why I just impulse bought a little Samson cartridge. Spoiler, I won't. If you enjoyed exploring the top 5 most underrated NES games, click this video here to see more from the Retro Reload. And, as always, thank you for watching.